There was a time when the wind whispered glories to the kingdom of Ulfheim, where the Viking king known as Sigurd reigned with a firm hand and indomitable spirit. His hair and beard, as black as the darkness of a starless night, became a symbol of strength and mystery among his people. The people believed that Sigurd carried the essence of the Norse gods, protecting them from threats both human and divine. But, like all greatness, the kingdom attracted envious glances, and among them was Albert, the cunning Anglo-Saxon king, who saw in Ulfheim not only lands to conquer, but also a throne that would make him immortal in history. Albert was different from the common warriors. While the Vikings trusted in the bravery of blades and the strength of shields, Albert bet on patience, intrigue, and poisoned diplomacy. He knew that attacking a king like Sigurd directly would be suicide, so he began to erode the kingdom from the edges, corrupting allies and sowing doubt among the clan chieftains. Every promise of gold or protection from Albert sounded like a treacherous echo in the wooden halls of Ulfheim, leaving Sigurd increasingly isolated. The threat was not a sword in his chest, but a lingering shadow that seemed to grow with each dawn. Sigurd, though known for his strength, was also a cunning man, and he felt the noose closing in. He knew that the loyalty of his people was his most powerful weapon, but holding it in the face of tempting promises and poisonous whispers was a challenge. He called his council and spoke with a voice like thunder, calling on all the chieftains to remember their oath to the gods and the throne of Ulfheim. But deep down, he knew that the real challenge would not lie in rallying the people, but in facing Albert directly, a man whose power came more from the mind than from the sword. And so, the fate of the kingdom hung like an uncertain balance, about to be decided. Before he became the king who now faces the shadow of treachery, Sigurd was known as the Storm Axe, a name that echoed like thunder among his enemies. From a young age, he demonstrated an unusual skill on the battlefield, not only in his physical strength but also in his strategic mind. It is said that in one of his first campaigns, he led an attack against a Saxon fleet in the middle of a stormy sea. As the ships rocked violently, Sigurd used the waves to his advantage, maneuvering his fleet with almost supernatural precision. The victory was so overwhelming that the Saxons began to call him the Fury of the North. Each battle Sigurd won was marked by stories that became legend. There was the battle at Eldaskog, where he and his men faced an army 5 times his size. Instead of retreating, he ordered his warriors to feign retreat, luring the enemy into a narrow valley. There, Sigurd cornered and defeated them with a brutality and efficiency that earned him the respect and fear of his allies and foes alike. To the people of Ulfheim, these victories were not just achievements. They were signs that Sigurd was protected by the gods, a man whose destiny was intertwined with greatness. But it was not only on the battlefield that he demonstrated his worth. Sigurd understood that true conquest went beyond weapons. He knew how to rule a conquered kingdom, offering strategic alliances and upholding the traditions of the conquered people. In doing so, he united cultures and expanded Ulfheim to a point few had thought possible. His legacy, however, was also scarred. With each victory, Sigurd accumulated enemies who waited patiently for the moment he would show any weakness. And now, this glorious past seemed to be both his greatest strength and his greatest burden. Where Sigurd was a man of steel and storm, Albert portrayed himself as God's chosen one, a monarch whose authority came from both the crown and the altar. Born into a kingdom where the power of the church intertwined with that of the throne, Albert learned early on that faith and politics were equally powerful weapons. He was not known for his physical strength or bravery on the battlefield, but for his ability to command with words that echoed like prayers and decrees. His kingdom prospered not through direct conquest but through the psychological dominance he exercised, keeping his subjects devoted and his allies eternally in his debt. Albert believed himself to be the hand of God on earth, a leader whose purpose was to expand the reach of his faith and his rule. He built magnificent churches, symbols of his alliance with the clergy, while he built armies that bore both the cross and the sword. Under his rule, the Anglo-Saxon kingdom became a powerhouse that combined religious fervor with military strategy. But his true skill lay in diplomacy. Albert knew when to offer sweet words and when to use the weight of excommunication as a threat that no leader dared ignore. For him, conquest was not just a matter of territory, but of the soul, and Sigurd, with his Norse gods, represented a challenge to the divine order he sought to impose. Despite his image as a saintly king, Albert was a ruthless strategist. He knew that wars won by faith were as bloody as those fought with blades. Using the church as both shield and sword, he sent emissaries to spread rumors and undermine the morale of his enemies, while promising redemption and protection to those who sided with him. His skill at turning physical battles into struggles of belief was unmatched. Yet behind the veneer of virtue lay a man who understood that absolute power required sacrifice, even from those who trusted in his blessing. And so, with the name of God on his lips, Albert prepared to challenge Sigurd, determined to prove that divine light would always triumph over the darkness of the old gods. The kingdom of Ulfheim under Sigurd was a land of extremes, both in landscape and spirit. Set between towering fjords and dense forests, the kingdom seemed a reflection of the king himself, majestic, untamed, and full of secrets. The capital, Skjoldstad, stood on a cliff overlooking the sea, its towers of wood and stone resisting icy winds that seemed to howl battle songs. At the center of the city, Sigurd's great hall was more than an imposing structure. It was the beating heart of Ulfheim, where warriors, skalds, and advisors gathered to share stories, forge alliances, and decide the future of the kingdom. Sigurd's reign was marked by a unique blend of strength and wisdom. He ruled with a firm hand, but also with respect for tradition and the voices of the clan chiefs. His people were an extension of his own essence, resilient, loyal, and passionate about freedom. Under his rule, Ulfheim flourished not only in wealth, but in culture and identity. There were festivals dedicated to the ancient gods, contests of strength, and heroic sagas sung to the tune of lyres. Trade was brisk, with merchants bringing spices, precious metals, and even exotic artifacts from lands beyond the sea. To Sigurd, a strong kingdom was one that honored the past while keeping an eye on the future. However, Ulfheim's true strength lay in its warriors. Raised from childhood to wield weapons and navigate the treacherous seas, Sigurd's Vikings were feared and respected. They trained to the sound of thunder and fought as if each battle were a sacred ritual. Sigurd believed that honor in combat was the essence of life, and he encouraged his men to seek glory not only through strength, but through strategy and courage. But just as the mountains that surrounded the kingdom hid dark valleys, so too did Sigurd's reign have its hidden threats. Even in times of apparent peace, he knew that the winds could change at any moment, bringing with them challenges that not even the might of Ulfheim could foresee. Sigurd and Albert's paths had first crossed almost discreetly, but the impact was like the clash of two storms. During an expedition to the south, Sigurd decided to explore the borders of his kingdom to assess the nearby lands, accompanied only by a few trusted men. In a valley shrouded in a thin mist, he spotted a foreign party, well-groomed horses, flags with Christian symbols, and a small detachment of Anglo-Saxon guards. At first, there was no hostility. The two parties stopped at a safe distance, observing each other with a wariness that said more than words could convey. Albert was there, recognizable by his proud posture and the cloak embroidered with golden crosses. He did not speak directly to Sigurd, but the look they exchanged was enough to seal something greater than any treaty. The Anglo-Saxon king stood firm, his eyes scrutinizing the Viking as one would examine a piece on a chessboard. Sigurd, for his part, did not look away, carrying within him the weight of a man who had already faced forces greater than mere mortality. Although nothing was said between them, there was a mutual understanding. Both knew that this meeting would not be the last, and that the next times would be marked by much more than silent exchanges. Before the delegations went their separate ways, Albert ordered one of his emissaries to give Sigurd a parchment. The Viking, suspicious, opened it later in his tent, finding words written in impeccable calligraphy. True strength lies not in the axe, but in the will that wields it. We are destined to meet again, and on that day, we will see whose will is stronger. Sigurd, upon reading, merely smiled at the corner of his mouth, but the sparkle in his eyes indicated that the challenge had been accepted. The reunion between the two kings was inevitable, like two tides that, so strong, cannot avoid colliding. Albert, with his razor-sharp mind, knew that an invasion was not about brute force alone, but about perceiving the enemy's weaknesses. So he sent undercover spies into Sigurd's kingdom, tasked with assessing not only its defenses, but the essence of what made Ulfheim unique. For weeks, Albert's men infiltrated the forests and villages, watching the inhabitants of Ulfheim with watchful eyes, like predators watching their prey before attacking. What they discovered was both fascinating and disturbing to the Anglo-Saxon king. Sigurd had created a kingdom where honor, strength, and the ancient gods ruled the hearts of the people. Every village seemed imbued with a primal energy, with pagan celebrations that honored the forces of nature and the myths of ancient warriors. The forges were always lit, the sound of hammers on metal reverberating like a uniting chant for all Vikings, and the festivals were filled with vigils and sacred rituals. For Albert, this was not just a rival culture. It was a direct threat to what he believed was the only path to true salvation. Sigurd's lands were like a kingdom lost in time, where the light of the cross had not yet penetrated. And this lack of faith in the one God was something he saw as a divine task to correct. Albert did not see Ulfheim simply as a kingdom to be conquered. He saw it as a land that needed to be converted, brought into the light of the Christian faith. The old gods, with their rituals of sacrifice and feasting, were an affront to his vision of a world governed by divine mercy. Observing the power that Sigurd wielded over his people, Albert understood that any victory over the Viking could not be merely military, but spiritual. He did not seek to dominate lands or riches, but the souls of the Vikings. For him, his true mission was to bring salvation to these people who, in his view, were lost in the shadows of ancient myths. Ulfheim needed to be illuminated, and he would be the lamp that would lead the pagans to the true light of Christ. Albert, with characteristic cunning, knew that a head-on battle with Sigurd would be too risky. The Viking was a seasoned warrior, and his army, though small, was fierce and unbeatable on familiar ground. So rather than advance directly, he opted for a more insidious tactic, the silent attack, carried out in the shadows of betrayal. To do this, he sought out someone within Sigurd's own kingdom, someone who, thirsty for power, would be susceptible to the promise of rewards. That man was Rurik, a trusted general of Sigurd's, but whose loyalty had always been a fine line, fueled by envy and ambition. Albert, with his refined diplomatic skills, contacted Rurik through an intermediary, assuring him that the only way to achieve greatness would be to betray his king. In exchange for his loyalty, Albert promised riches, lands, and a place of honor in his empire. Rurik, whose ambition outstripped his loyalty, saw an opportunity he could not ignore. For weeks, he negotiated secretly with Albert's emissaries, hatching the plan that would ultimately seal Sigurd's fate. The pact was sealed, and Rurik became the key to the downfall of a kingdom that had previously seemed unstoppable. With Rurik inside Sigvid's castle, Albert launched his attack strategically and stealthily. While Sigvid prepared for a military campaign in another region of the kingdom, Rurik ensured that Ulfheim's defenses were weakened. He sabotaged communication routes, weakened alliances with the other clans, and finally spread rumors among Sigvid's warriors, sowing doubt and distrust. When Albert's army finally crossed the borders, Sigvid was isolated and vulnerable, unaware that his trust in one of his own men had sealed his doom. The fall of the kingdom of Ulfheim, which had seemed unimaginable, was now closer than ever. Sigvid, confident in his strength and experience, had set out on a military campaign in the northern lands, taking with him the 50 best warriors of Ulfheim. The mission was clear: to expand the domain of his kingdom, explore new lands and seek resources that would ensure the prosperity of his people. But as he and his men sailed through stormy seas, battling the forces of nature and facing enemies from unknown lands, the fate of Ulfheim was being quietly and treacherously determined. With each passing day, the kingdom fell, one step at a time, under Albert's rule. During these 3 weeks of absence, Rurik, now Albert's ally, became the new ruler of Ulfheim, taking control of the cities and forging an alliance with the local leaders who had previously sworn loyalty to Sigvid. The kingdom was being taken over from within, with the inhabitants torn between fear of a new leader and the betrayal that spread through the streets. Albert's troops, supported by Rurik's strategy, advanced rapidly, crushing any resistance that arose. The old Viking traditions were replaced by the imposition of new laws, those that concerned the church and the power of God, and the temples dedicated to the old gods began to be torn down, replaced by chapels and crosses. Sigvid, in his distant camp, was oblivious to what was happening in his kingdom. With each victory won in the battles of the north, he felt that he was one step closer to securing the future of Ulfheim. But the truth was that the future of his kingdom was already being rewritten without him. With no communication with the interior of his lands, and without the slightest inkling of the treachery that was taking place, Sigvid continued to fight as always, believing that his people were safe and that Ulfheim remained under his command. But the clock was ticking, and when he finally returned, he would discover that his homeland was no longer the same, and that his absence had been the greatest mistake of his life. As Sigvid and his men prepared to return to their kingdom, a lone figure approached their camp, exhausted and covered in dust. It was Ivar, a young warrior who had served Sigvid for years, one of many who looked to him as a leader and mentor. Ivar, his eyes filled with despair and determination, had escaped the clutches of Albert and Rurik's men. He had run for days, facing unimaginable dangers, to deliver a crucial message to his king. Upon finding Sigvid, he fell to his knees, panting, and with a trembling voice, he spoke. "My king, Ulfheim has been taken. Albert has crowned himself High King, and now Sigvid's golden crown shines upon his head, while the people suffer under his tyranny." Ivar's words struck Sigvid straight to the heart. He could hardly believe what he was hearing, and for a moment, silence fell over the camp. But the pain quickly turned to anger. Sigvid looked at his men, the 50 warriors who followed him with unwavering loyalty, and knew what he had to do. "Prepare yourselves, men of Ulfheim. Our kingdom will be reclaimed," Sigvid commanded, the flame of vengeance burning in his eyes. He knew that Albert and Rurik might have taken his crown, but they had not yet conquered his spirit. Sigvid's return would be the answer Ulfheim so desperately needed. Meanwhile, Albert, in his newly crowned castle, basked in his newfound glory. Seated on a throne, now adorned with Sigvid's golden crown, he proclaimed to all present, "I am the supreme king. The power of God has consecrated me, and there's no more room for the old gods in this realm. The crown, shining beneath the flaming torches, seemed to symbolize more than his victory. It was a banner of domination, a piece of symbolism that Albert believed was the sign of his divinity and the glorious future of Christianity over the pagans. But even as he laughed and rejoiced in his victory, the sound of iron and steel being sharpened echoed in the distance. Sigurd, the true king, was coming to claim what had always been his. Sigurd and his men arrived at the borders of Ulfheim under the cover of night, moving like shadows through the dense forests. He knew that any hasty move could cost them their advantage. The kingdom, now under Albert's rule, was different. The castle towers that had once been symbols of Viking power were no longer imposing, more surrounded. Sigurd watched the distance with keen eyes, analyzing every movement of the patrols and every flag fluttering on the tall castles. Albert's presence still loomed over Ulfheim like an imposing shadow, but Sigurd knew that a direct confrontation would be a fatal trap. He must act cautiously. In the days that followed, Sigurd enlisted his best spies to infiltrate the villages and markets of the kingdom. He wanted to understand the new system imposed by Albert, identify weak points in the castle's defenses, and explore the possibilities that might exist between the newcomers and the old inhabitants of Ulfheim. He knew that many of his people were divided, fearing the punishment of Albert and his new order. But Sigurd also knew that the loyalty of Ulfheim's former subjects could still be awakened. So he began to articulate plans, based not only on force but also on words. He would need to revive the warrior spirit of his people, calling them back to the fight. Meanwhile, Albert, now ensconced in his castle, with his golden crown on his head, seemed to believe that his victory was assured. He celebrated his conquests with exaggerated confidence, making rash decisions and underestimating Sigurd's cunning. Sigurd watched for a long time, waiting for the right moment to act. He knew that he could not attack in haste. He had to play on the enemy's confidence. And so he devised his strategy, a psychological siege. Sigurd would make Albert believe that the kingdom was safer than ever, while, in the shadows, he prepared the real retaliation. Sigurd knew the time to act was near. He had gained the trust of some of the most skilled warriors in the kingdom, men and women who still believed in the freedom of Ulfheim and the return of the true crown. The news that a lunar eclipse was about to occur was like a sign from the gods, a rare opportunity that he could not waste. The darkness that would envelop the night would be the perfect ally for his plan of attack in the shadows. He gathered his group and shared his strategy, each move carefully calculated. Nothing could go wrong. As the night of the eclipse approached, Sigurd and his warriors prepared. The idea was simple but effective. Instead of attacking the castle directly, they would infiltrate the smaller walls, the ones that Albert believed were secure and that were rarely guarded. Using the eclipse to cloak their movements, they would move quickly and silently, like ghosts among the shadows. Sigurd trusted in his ability to disguise his intentions and, more importantly, in the patience his warriors had learned over the years. They would not be mere invaders. They would be shadows of vengeance. The plan was well underway when the eclipse finally began. The sky gradually darkened, and the moonlight was swallowed up by darkness, creating a night deeper than any other. Sigurd and his warriors positioned themselves in the shadows of the trees and bushes, their swords and axes ready for action. They awaited the signal. The tension was palpable, but no one moved before it was time. The entrance to the castle was now in sight, but before they approached, Sigurd paused and looked up at the dark sky. He knew this might be the point of no return. Victory or death were about to intertwine in a deadly dance. Sigurd took a deep breath, and with a silent signal, the raid began. The attack began as a whisper in the darkness. Sigurd and his warriors moved in absolute silence, their shadows blending into the darkness of the lunar eclipse. Every step was calculated, every breath controlled. The castle guards, confident in the safety of the night and oblivious to Sigvard's possible return, barely noticed the invaders approaching. Sigvard, sword in hand and eyes fixed on the central tower, headed straight for the weakest point of the fortress, Rurik's cell. The general who had betrayed his own king, with his seemingly unbreakable loyalty to Albert, would now face the vengeance of the man he had helped to overthrow. Rurik sat alone in his cell, distracted by thoughts of victory and arrogance. He did not know that, just a few feet from his prison, death awaited him. Sigvard entered like a shadow, his movement swift and silent. In a matter of seconds, Sigvard's warriors had Rurik pinned down, silencing any resistance that might have arisen. The general, with his fiery eyes and arrogant words, tried to fight back, but he was already at a disadvantage. Sigvard, with a merciless gaze, approached and, with one precise movement, delivered the final blow. Rurik fell, and the betrayal was corrected with Viking justice. With Rurik finally down, Sigvard and his warriors wasted no time. They advanced towards the castle, each step more confident, knowing that victory was within their grasp. When they reached the great gate of Ulfheim, Sigvard stopped before it, surveying the now silent castle, as if already accepting the inevitable. He looked at his men, who stood beside him, ready for what was to come. Sigvard took a deep breath, and with a gesture, ordered the gates to be opened. He stood before his home, ready to reclaim what was rightfully his. But he knew that the worst was yet to come. Sigvard's invasion was relentless. With his warriors and allies in perfect unison, he swept through the castle walls like a tidal wave, destroying everything in its path. The doors that Albert had so proudly taken were now being thrown open with the sound of splintering wood, as if the castle itself knew that its new lord's downfall was imminent. Sigvard and his men advanced through the corridors, eliminating the guards with precision, moving through the rooms with silent ferocity. The walls that had witnessed Albert's arrogance now bore witness to the return of a true king. Each battle within the castle seemed to be a distant echo of Sigvard's past victories, a reminder that he was no ordinary man, but the rightful heir to the throne. In the heart of the castle, Sigvard encountered his greatest obstacle, Albert's Grand Master, a giant of steel and experience who had been the Anglo-Saxon king's right-hand man and now prepared to defend what remained of the kingdom. He wielded his sword skillfully, a formidable opponent. But Sigvard was no longer the young man who took foolish risks. He had the heart of a warrior and the mind of a strategist. The battle was intense, the clang of swords echoing throughout the castle. Each of Sigvard's blows was calculated, precise, and finally, with one unexpected move, he disarmed the Grand Master, leaving him vulnerable. The man fell to his knees, and Sigvard, with a cold stare, delivered the final blow, cutting down what remained of the Anglo-Saxon resistance. With the Grand Master dead, the castle was finally under Sigvard's rule. Albert, the king who had believed himself supreme, was now isolated, and his reign was about to end. Sigvard advanced to the great throne room, where Albert waited for him, his golden crown still gleaming, but his look was one of despair. The Anglo-Saxon king knew he had failed, that the divine power he believed he possessed would not save him. Sigvard, with his imposing presence, looked at Albert, who tried to resist until the last moment. But there was no more room for words or agreements. With a quick gesture, Sigvard tore the golden crown from Albert's head and placed it on his own. Silence fell over the room, and the last vestige of Anglo-Saxon rule vanished in that instant. Sigvard sat on the throne, the golden crown now resting on his head. He surveyed the whole, where the history of his lineage, his land, and his battle for justice was etched in stone and shadow. The kingdom he had reclaimed lay in ruins, but with the strength of his leadership, he knew that Ulfheim would be reborn. His warriors gathered around him, and the kingdom, now free from Albert's tyranny, would once again be ruled by courage, honor, and wisdom. Sigurd looked ahead, his gaze steady and his heart resolute. The throne was now his, but his work had only just begun. He had retaken his kingdom, but the real battle for Ulfheim's prosperity was yet to come. Did you like this story? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next epic sagas. The journey continues.